Good afternoon, Luca. Thank you so much for joining me today. It's always a pleasure when I get to speak with you.
Chris, it's always great to chat with you. Always great.
Especially in this new, more intimate kind of we're taking fireside chat to a whole new meeting, I think, with this one.
Well,
I think
we are right on point, right? With the fire behind you. I don't have a fireplace, but I kind of create a little bit of ambient with my lights, and I'm happy to have you in my what I call my bat cave. So
oh, I think we have actually LG to thank for that particular fireplace right there. But no,
I see that
it's
this video is not sponsored by LG, right?
no, could be.
Could be.
We
That's a
wouldn't
good
be.
opportunity.
We're not putting it off the table, but as it stands, though, we are completely free. But actually, we're not here to talk about fireplaces or anything along that effect today. We're actually here to talk about a very hot topic right now, which is GraphQL. Now, before we really get into this one, and I'm actually kind of proud to say that I've done a fair bit of homework for this interview. I am trying very hard not to look silly or like I don't know what I'm talking about. So we'll see how well I do with that. But that being said, what spawned this discussion and me wanting to talk with Luca right now was this. And it was an article that mobileLIVE published in the not so distant past that has been getting a continuously large amount of traffic, which only means one thing, that GraphQL is a very hot topic. So before kind of meeting with you here today, I wanted to see if I could kind of dive into the world of tech a little bit more and figure out exactly what GraphQL was, what APIs are, what RESTful is, etc., to try and see if I can kind of get a better handle on things going forward. So if you'll humor me and feel free to give me a passing grade at the end of this, I'm going to see how well I can explain these concepts before we get started. You ready?
Let's do it.
Okay. So an API is like a waiter. It goes to the customer or the user, takes their order, figures out exactly what they want, and takes that order to the kitchen, which would be the application. And then once they get figured out exactly what they're looking for, they would take that and take it all and bring it back to the customer. Correct? In a nutshell, I know you like food analogies. I may have purposely used that one.
Yeah, no, that's correct.
Okay, perfect. So far we're good. So now RESTful or REST APIs is a way of building an application essentially where a lot of the historically kind of hidden components or elements that are malleable for it are exposed so that people can easily kind of change it to suit their needs. Correct?
Correct. Yeah, REST is a
I'm
protocol, right? We define it a protocol.
I'm 2 for 2 right now. I hope somebody at home's taking score on this one. Now, here's where it gets, I think, a little bit tricky for me. So now we have GraphQL. Now, GraphQL is a query language, correct? And which to me just sounds like another way of saying pickup line. But so how is GraphQL different from REST? Because that's really as far as I've gotten. So I'm going to look to you now.
Yeah, so we need to take a little bit of a journey there, right? To understand why GraphQL, what's GraphQL, and where it differs from REST, right? So systems and communication has been evolving, right, in the past decade. And as part of this evolution, right, that we in our business called digital transformation journey, right, there were different phases of this transformation. And one of them was the API transformation, right? So we started evolving and taking systems away from that mostly kind of like chatty way of communicating, right? The so-called RPC way to RPC means remote procedure call, which means I demand an action and this action gives me back an answer, right? So a result. Um, to a way where the interaction should have been more a continuous handshake between the client and the application provider, so the application programming interface, they call API. Because what happened in this between is that all assets that were living within the organizations, now they had a new monetization opportunity. If I expose something that I built to somebody else, this somebody else can benefit and I can benefit out of it, right? So I can have this kind of like fair exchange, right, with other consumers, right? So it all triggered what is called API economy, right? The companies went in this journey of understanding how to monetize those assets that were anyhow living within their confines and take them outside of their borders, right? Take it to the open world. So in this journey, clearly, something also happened, right? That we are taking applications, we are expanding the horizon of applications. Mobile came to place, iOS created this explosion in mobile usage. Web and mobile were going hand in hand. And now new channels were creating more and more and more because opening those gates enabled different type of interactions with the systems for different type of purposes.
So no longer was it just the create, delete, those like kind of three essential really core commands that you could.
The so-called CRUD, right? CRUD operations, CRUD. The thing is, yes, those operations, right? They were basically the common actions that every single application would do it, right? And were read at different requirements than write. So create, update, and delete. And in this kind of like a evolution journey, we started to see that the more API we create, right, the more we start to separate the concerns, the microservices, the more we create a counter problem that now my client needs to make n more requests to get what they needed. And so now you see this mobile client, those web application having to make a lot of requests to get, for example, user profile overview. Like imagine our clients, but in general, like, let's look at the market. Let's abstract, our clients and our day-to-day for a second. Let's talk about the theoretical side, the more kind of like abstracted side. Is that when you build a user profile, or for example, you build any sort of application that is read intensive, you basically most of the time needs to aggregate data because you are not showing a wizard to your clients, right? You're not showing something that is fragmented. You want to say something that is aggregated because the value to the clients, to the customers, to the consumers is this aggregation. Once we aggregate, we can personalize and so on, right? Because we have.
But you've got to keep it light.
Correct. You keep this omnia sense around the client. And so if we look at basically this aggregation problem, then REST that was defining this model-driven approach and this kind of like unilateral way of communicating with models and with entities and with data at the end of the day, kind of like fell short on fulfilling this aggregation because now you see with this API economy, everything becomes highly distributed, right? But at the end of the day, coordination and aggregation are A, the challenge, and B, what is really needed at the client side. And so different technologies came to place, right? So we went through multiple attempts. One first was the so-called href API or hypermedia API. Basically, I start challenging my API, asking always what's next, right? And so I build this journey as some sort of steps. It's good. I can build aggregation. Everything is a link, so it's very fast to retrieve, and then I can parallelize requests and get them back. But still, far from ideal. We went through the BFF, the backend for front end. That's where REST kind of like continue the journey of implementation, right? Say, well, I can build an API that knows how to aggregate other APIs because I know what the client wants, right? But that's not true because we all know that clients' demands are changing, continuously. And ergo, for a company to stay competitive, they always need to be ahead of the curve. In order to be ahead of the curve, they need to present multiple permutations of their offering, their data, their experience to the user, and select the most efficient one and continuously go in improvement, right? Keeping this agile, this nimble approach.
And so REST is not up for that kind of?
Well, REST is the development model around REST. The traditional model doesn't really fulfill for speed, because every time you need to continuously, apply changes, right? I know that some of the audience will argue and say, oh, you can build filters, but filters, they're also limiting, because filters, they're linearly representing a finite set of permutation of how you can filter this data. Filters are filtering, they're not combining, just like a very important thing.
So are you telling me that I think this is the first time this has ever happened in my entire career, that something that is called REST is simply underperforming because it's not fast enough? Like, is this like a self-proclaiming fulfilling prophecy? Like, is that, like, that can't just be coincidental?
No, I mean, but we also need to be careful, right? Because what I'm looking at is basically are the shortcoming of where not only REST, but many other protocols or many other methodology and architectures, they kind of failed. But at the same time, GraphQL or REST are not one size fits all. That's what I'm trying to say, right? So there are spaces where REST is extremely efficient, right? So if you are looking, for example, at what I call operational APIs or backend APIs, or something that needs to provide a self-defined, very well-defined functionality, right? I personally feel that REST is phenomenal for them, but when I say REST, I also lying to myself a little bit, because if I had to design it, I would design it using gRPC, because I'm, very provocatively, I have a very strong opinion on how those systems should interact, right? And I still believe that when you are in an intranet, REST, it's a little bit of let me use like a little bit of a strong term, a lame excuse, a lame choice, because you could actually use gRPC, right? And have anyhow this very procedural way of operating with your system that is abstracted from the client, and shield it with technologies like GraphQL. But the nicest thing of GraphQL, I think, came to the point when, for example, GraphQL came right after a technology that Netflix. So there were different attempts, right? There were a lot of open source projects. eBay was probably the first company that thought about creating a SQL-driven protocol to query APIs, right? It went some sort of nowhere, but it was the foundation for another way of interpreting this system, right? There was Falcor, created by Netflix. Falcor, in my personal opinion, great idea, poor implementation. And I tell you the reason why. Is it was so highly complicated to manage that it became the opposite of frictionless. And the protocol itself, so the protocol is based on the concept of trees, right? If you want, I can take a moment to explain what changes behind the scene, right? So the more you distribute, the more you create a network, right? You agree, right? I take a lot of things, scatter them around. There are still relationships between those things, right? On how I combine them. And so if you listen to one of my public talks, or if you kind of like read some of the articles, the idea is that an API basically represents is a clear representation of the data underlying those APIs plus a set of functionalities. So it's actually acting as an actor on top of a data set that it represents. That's what REST also does. It represents domains. And what is very interesting about GraphQL and this concept is that in this distributed and federated world, actually we are creating a glorified graph, right? Basically a huge tree, right? And so if you look at this tree, the aggregation of this of all these data points, right, are the core of the old value proposition, right? So I have all these kind of services and data sources, and I need to create a unified API. GraphQL allows me to connect all those dots and define exactly how those aggregations should be handled behind the scenes. But I still empower the user, right? So Falcor was all about creating, I don't want to say omni-channel APIs because it's a very strong term, but the Falcor was there to fulfill the different aggregation requirements that they were continuously changing from the front-end APIs, the front-end application like the TV UI or the mobile client or the web or so on and so forth. Because all these organizations, they were going through a huge microservice transformation, right? So they were layering, splitting, rebuilding the monolith into these more atomic services, the microservices. And so now look at all the things, right? Now it's starting to make sense. And Facebook, a group inside of Facebook, conceptualized this evolution into GraphQL, right? There is a very interesting video that maybe we can share with the audience, created by Honeypot. Beautiful. If you go on YouTube and Google and search for Honeypot, they have a beautiful video about the story of GraphQL. So I don't bore you with that. Just probably we will link it and people can.
Yeah, we'll absolutely find it. Put it in the comments below.
What is very interesting is the kind of like evolution where we are at in this moment in time. Web applications were growing, mobile applications were growing, and there were all these different needs coming from the client side to aggregate and to put all these things together and create a single unique entry point. And GraphQL was at the right time, in the right place, with the right solution. And the rest is history. I think GraphQL became, and is still, and I think it will be for some time, the standard on how we kind of like define those interfaces, right? This communication. Once again, GraphQL is not one size fits all, right? It's fitting a specific use case. That is, I have read intents. I know friends of mine like Matteo Collira and other people might argue that you can use it also to do post, so create in the terms of like, if you go take a step back into the HTTP standard and REST, you can do everything. But my personal feeling is that if you look at the world as a system that is macroscopically split in two pieces, the first one is the read intents and the other one are the write. And if you look at this kind of like macro architecture, you'll see that GraphQL fits perfectly laterally and cross-cutting exactly in that piece of read intents operations and APIs. So, for example, with GraphQL, you can, and I made a talk in 2019, very interesting, about GraphQL and Elasticsearch, right? When you take now graph structures that are similar to each other, you can be very creative. So you can, for example, build these dynamic resolvers that they go into these kind of like data structures that they already have capabilities of fulfilling read operations. Because let me say only this thing, and then I know that you have a question, but one thing I really want to say is that every time that you do a GET, so that you ask to an API to give you something, let's all think about what are you really doing? You're doing a search. Right? It always ends up into a select somewhere, or you return a value, which is a search in memory, or you return something that is the result of searching something particular and returning it to you.
So I think I'm completely completely following exactly what you're saying. So as the digital world, as everything keeps increasing, data is king. However, as applications start to do more functions for more things, they can't be so data. They can't keep all that data, themselves. They need to aggregate it. They need to be able to quickly recall it. However, also as the world keeps growing, all of those data points are also exponentially growing as large, making it very difficult to efficiently access all of those different data points, which is pretty much the ask of everybody these days. GraphQL is an efficient way of essentially orchestrating all of those interactions.
You actually use the right term. Is an orchestrator. At the end
Well,
of the day, is a pure and simple orchestrator, right? Nothing.
you
So if you
see,
look at architectural way, is an orchestrator pattern. So
well, sorry to interrupt, but I
no,
just
no.
want to. I think this is following a point. Is I wanted to kind of keep on with the theme of evolution, and I'm glad that you brought up some of your talks as well, because prior to this, I spent a little time. I googled your name. I'm surprised you don't have an IMBD credit, to be complete. A couple of those credits under your map or under your head, to be completely honest. But I've heard you mention to myself as well that GraphQL is like an evolution, and taking a bit of a historical kind of journalistic approach to it, doing my research. Rust is not a young player on the game. The concept behind it has been has been prevalent for close to 20 years now, or since the early 2000s. Yet really, it seems that Rust fulfilled a place, obviously for quite a long time. And speaking upon that evolution term, you alluded to this in a couple of your talks as well. But those, and while they were quite kind of recent, 2019, 2020, today is a much different environment than we find ourselves in, especially with the pandemic and everything. How has that evolution has it quickened in your are you finding with like the appetite for this?
So it's I think like I said, they're not mutually exclusive, right? I just want to reinforce every time the two technologies are not mutually exclusive. They are highly complementary to each other, and I think this evolution path is not gonna reach an end anytime soon. And I tell you, the reason is that our systems are, and you mentioned actually the social situation, right, that we have been through in the past 2 years, is that we are distributing and we are getting more and more acquainted and familiar and comfortable with distribution, right? So this distribution is at the core of the problem that an orchestrator is trying to solve, right? If you think about Kubernetes, if you think about any sort of orchestrator, like in any sort of environment, right? So the thing that GraphQL as a technology is fulfilling is actually going hand in hand with the social transformation and technology transformation is a natural evolution, right? What actually is kind of like scary between quotes is that is a new protocol, right? So GraphQL has their own way of being. A GraphQL service needs to have a GraphQL client to be queried efficiently, right? Unless you don't want to write everything by yourself. And that's where I see that the macro opportunities will come. The world, I think we will see enterprise already adjusting to that, right? So we know from our customers that there is a huge trend into this digital transformation, right? And digital transformations sees and will see for some time GraphQL having a core component as an entry point for all digital experiences, because the consumers are more nimble than system integrations, right? But on the system integration side, like imagine integrating two building systems, right? It will not be GraphQL. Let's be very honest. This is because there is this inherited knowledge, right? And we also need to think about. I sometimes make a joke that wants to reflect the reality, right? All these technologies, they come to place because some young and bright minds, they want to abstract dependencies from them. And so they are finding ways to abstract and to accelerate and to decouple, right? And if you look at other things, other protocols, they are actually based on inherited coupling, because if you look at, there is so much history attached to them, that there is so much sentiment, and ergo, people, they feel comfortable, right? So what I like, does it make sense to you what I'm saying?
I think so, and I think you may be inadvertently kind of tugging at my romantic side a little bit, but it's the fact remains is what was currently available simply wasn't satisfying the needs, and it almost, when you talk about the aggregation of data, and we all know like how important that is and the value held behind it. I imagine these like really big corporations that essentially just don't want to share it. They want to keep everything themselves. They want to keep doing it their ways. They want to have a monopoly over it, because kind of what you're describing is almost like is democratizing. So you have these young bright minds who are trying to, why do we have to do it like this? I can do this and share it with him. And then when him and I share this thing together, then we can do something like 10 times as good. And then that essentially just kind of transcends itself and gets itself going on. And then as the more and more people do it, we'll start to see, like, when the young kids are doing it, essentially, and the old people are like, oh shit, they're doing that now? Okay, we got to do some facsimile of it. Or we kind of have to play catch up. And then that sort of eventually becomes the status quo. Did I do it any justice in that?
Yeah, I think once again, technology is such a beautiful space, right? Because technology is this beautiful constant wave, right? Of change, and I think it's brilliant, right? It's a space that naturally evolves based on the environment, based on multiple situations, based on the people that are contributing to it. And for what I can say is that you know the world of services, of large scale infrastructure is going through like a lot of transformation and changes, right? Because um, that's a natural evolution of our system. So now we interact with those systems, right? And so this kind of like abstraction that is created between the consumer and the system that the consumer is interacting with, that's what demands actually the need and is creating the urge of accelerating and changing and disrupting sometime, right? So, Jack Dorsey once had this phenomenal point about disruption versus revolution, right? Which I completely agree with. I think it's a masterpiece in terms of entrepreneurship, right? But it is some sort of like statement that I use also when I look at technology and say, sometimes you need a disruption. You need to destroy things. You need to make a mess out of it. Sometimes you just need to do a revolution. Sometimes you need to aggregate things and change them as a collective, and that's where I see actually technology going. And I think GraphQL has been the clear example of this understanding. And I don't want to limit only to GraphQL. I think there is a huge credit that needs to be given to Falcor at Netflix, a huge credit to eBay for being like pioneers into, start to look at the world of API and service interaction as basically some sort of glorified data points. Microsoft has been doing a phenomenal effort in that space in the past. We're talking about like probably, I don't know, that's 15 years ago with OData. But all those kind of things, they didn't work somehow, right? And now all this learning has been put together by a collective of people. And that's what I think is actually brilliant, is the fact that all these kind of assets are taken out from this domain proprietary knowledge, and they are taken directly into the community, directly into this brilliant space of collaboration.
And they almost get this seemingly organic quality to how it seems to be growing and evolving and solving itself when you kind of share and spread out that problem a little bit.
Yeah, because the all kind of like a sentiment, the all energy is automatically reflected in the technology and the requirements of this technology, right? Just like, let's take a step and look at how the majority of protocols were also created in the past. They were created out of, patents or by, large organizations that they could put a lot of research investment on developing those protocols, right? But what I find it brilliant is that GraphQL came almost kind of like, driven by some sort of like magical entity in the right time. It's a right transformative time, right? It's like we saw that it was the convergence of many, many interesting transformation and evolution in the open source space, right? We saw technologies that they were coming together. We saw the apex of JavaScript, and it almost came at the right time to kind of like feel that gap, that missing spot between all these brilliant technologies that were there. So that's kind of like energizes, right, about GraphQL. But that doesn't mean anything against REST. REST is phenomenal for doing, like I said, system integrations to define domain-driven approach. You can do it also with GraphQL. But Chris, one thing that I heard and I continuously hear is that sometimes it doesn't need to be complicated, or you can just do it in REST. I can do it with that. I know, to be honest, I know that I can hammer a needle in the wall using a screwdriver or using my laptop, but is that the right tool? How much energy am I putting to achieve the same point? And then it brings me back to something that my father told me related to some sort of accepting the reality, right? And I remember my dad telling me, sometimes you just need a screw. You need to stop to hammer that needle in the wall, right? And I think it reflects perfectly also in this technology space, right? Sometimes we just need to accept that we need a different tool to do something. And that's why I don't think there should be bias in technology. Technology is just a tool, right? Every chef has their favorite knife, right? You know it.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that they can cook with other knives, or they don't use other knives, or they don't buy a new knife because it's better.
So what you described about how GraphQL kind of came to being in this perfect storm really was like kind of the concept of the adjacent possible. There was the right technology was available at the time that preceded it. There was enough trial and error. People had learned enough communally to actually get to that tipping point where GraphQL could be. And from our conversation, from my research, and I'm sure pretty much everyone who'd be watching this knows, is that GraphQL, when we kind of iterated this, it complements the way that the world via digital transformation is being architected. It, with the dispersed and aggregated data, the demands of the consumers and what they have of their digital products, GraphQL is highly, highly complementary of that, correct?
Correct. Is decoupling, is making the system even more distributed, right?
So why are we talking about it so much, and why is it not just being done? Like, why is it? And I know it is being done, but like to a point, like if it works, if it's why is not everybody simply doing it? Like, there must be some. You mentioned sentiment. I imagine people still kind of held up on the comfort of doing things the old way, but let's be honest, 20 years of rest, and then now it's time for a little unrest. And we've got the way that you describe it. I just don't see what is the hesitation? Is it as a layman, am I missing something?
It's a very, very good question, right? So I
usually have at least one per session.
No, I mean, I don't want to tell the story of my life, but I can tell you that GraphQL has a major challenge that is the fact that it is disruptive, is highly disruptive. Is disruptive inside of organizations because it requires to rethink and relook at huge investments that were done in the past into the microservices kind of transformation. And also because the protocol itself is disruptive. It requires a different way to query and to make changes. It needs to do new testing. So automatically is seen as a risk, right? Now, I personally feel that this sentiment, this point of view, the whole fear are well justified. And you say, what the hell are you saying, right? Doesn't make sense. And I said, no, it makes sense because it's correct, right? So it's a huge change for many organizations, and but because we haven't been able to formulate in a very cohesive, very simple, very business-oriented way the advantages of the technology against the cost and the risk. So what can this technology really do, and how it actually is a pivotal um, component of omni-channel experiences, and reusability, and so on and so forth. And also because I think there is a gap in the market on how we can actually make it easier for enterprise to adopt GraphQL. Because truth has to be told, many organizations are using it.
Mm-hmm.
Not many
Usually startups. Yeah.
Usually startups. Usually people that they're taking starter kits from, any, open source project. They get GraphQL. GraphQL, but GraphQL has never been explained in the enterprise context, right? So if you watch my talk from 2019 when I was chief architect at Talos Digital, that was the kind of like evolution of something that, to be very honest with you, I conceptualized first in June 2016 on a trip down to Florida. And that was kind of like the beginning of seeing that intersection between GraphQL and Elasticsearch, for example, right? For solving this kind of very interesting problem. And believe it or not, we implemented the first proof of concept for one of the largest insurance companies in the world, um, to replace some of the mainframes, right? And that was very provocative. Like an ex-colleague of mine, when I was at Talos, actually always used this beautiful term, right? When I was talking, provocative, and I make it my own term because I think it's true, right? You need to be provocative sometimes to make those changes. And the environment at the time was great to make that transformation because um, it was probably the right time, the right place with the right people to try this thing. It was a pioneer attempt, right? If you only think that AWS came only 1.5 years later with this concept on Amplify, it tells you that we were basically 1.5 years ahead of probably one of the largest R&D companies in the world. And we put it in production, right? So it was pretty interesting to see it flowing. And then, these evolutions, they went into understanding the enterprise ecosystem. When I was in the past working in consultancy, we work with large Fortune 100 and Fortune 500, and we saw a pattern, right? This pattern was actually very, very clear to us and not clear to them. And in the talk that I made in 2019 at NodeConf, um, I personally think that approach was kind of like trying to open the door, right, for many more enterprises to, think about how you can actually let GraphQL and the existing APIs and the existing data set coexist in a mission of transforming the whole organization in a more kind of like real time, more event driven, more, caching based. So for the people that they don't want to watch like 25 minutes of me talking in Italian English, in English Italian, basically is using GraphQL on top of Elasticsearch with an event-based system that materializes continuously all these data sets into Elasticsearch, and having Elasticsearch as the only data source on top of GraphQL. And because you can do those things, then you can play very interesting thing of doing data pre-materialization, and so push all this kind of fragment of data sets into a CDN, so that basically when you call the API, in reality you're just calling a file on the CDN, so it's super fast, right? And you can play nowadays with cloud, you can play with all these kind of mad science things. Now it's not really mad science anymore, because from 2019 till now, we have web workers and workers currently on Cloudflare. We have edge functions that they can do all those kind of things. But at the time, it was pretty pioneer approach. And in 2016, also we kind of, when I was once again working in a consultancy, we kind of came up with this interesting concept of basically where is the world going? Is it going into having functions or having services, right? And I made this very provocative statement on a stage saying the world will be governed by functions instead of being all services, right? And the reality is coming true, right? It's kind of funny. It was functions were not there yet as a solid, production concept, right? And but because of this distribution, right? Because the more you distribute, the trick is that the more you distribute, if you think about the service mesh, the more you can vertically and laterally abstract. Because the more you distribute, the more you need to make the thing small, which means that you can create all these master overlays, all these kind of overlays that they govern and control all these different operational functions. That is the problem of the Byzantine generals, right? And this is the core on blockchain. Blockchain solves, implements the solution to this problem at a massive scale, right? To solve in one of the most elegant ways that we can think, right? So the same question could have been there. Can blockchain be evolved? Is that something that goes beyond that? That shall we just, should financial institutions go on blockchain, right? So I don't want to enter into the political conversation, but from a technology perspective, and I'm saying. Oh no, please go if you wanted to.
No, I was just gonna say, well, what do I know? But I was just gonna say, if you're constantly looking, should we go in for blockchain? Oh, but what's going to be next? Well, if you're constantly, the grass is always greener on the other side. You can't constantly. At what point are you, okay, now they're building cars. I'm still trying to build a faster buggy and breed a faster horse. Like at what point does it?
It always depends, right? So. And that's where, in this conversation with this friend of mine, sometimes we just don't need it, right? So that's the most important.
Like Google Glass.
like many things. Like that I love fast cars, right? And and the whole question is that why would you buy that car if you can only drive 50 kilometers an hour, right? It's true, but then I buy a bike, because I know that I will not go 50 kilometers an hour with a bike, right? It's all about understanding the right balance, the healthy balance between need and wish, right? Sometimes we make technological choices and choices that they help us laterally in other initiatives, like why using open source, right? Why do I need to build open source? There are so many questions, right? And I always say, if you look at having a single answer, you will never find it, because that single answer doesn't exist. It doesn't fit you. The answer is how you actually use this particular technology or this particular thing to benefit you on a multitude of smaller things.
So, right? As trying to pull a controversial and kind of provocative statement out of you, would you say that there are a multitude of companies and enterprises out there right now who are not properly utilizing the technology that's in front of them?
100%. I think the majority of them, if not everyone, is because, and I'm not saying it to be too provocative or too arrogant in that space, is that the reality is that we are making this statement looking from a single point of view, right? That's also unfair. We need to look at the all different angles of this of the problem that we're trying to solve, right? So, like for example, in the past, when I was very early in Node.js, and there was this controversial thing, and you can go on Google and see my talks. I was going very strong against certain technologies like Java. And people were like reaching out and say, okay, but how can we transform? Shall we just throw away? And I said, no, you see, that's wrong. It's a provocative statement to help everyone to ask their question directly to themselves and to the people in their organization on collaborating on the future of their future and the future of the organization, right? So it's a provocative statement, but that doesn't mean that you need to kind of like wipe out your development force and jump on a new technology, right? It's all about giving the opportunity even to people to learn and grow, right? That's where I see technology being very interesting, is doing social transformation sometimes. Like imagine somebody working in COBOL for like 25 years, right? I know that it's comfortable to work in COBOL, but it's our responsibility to support them and help these people to, go hand in hand with technology growth. Once again, we always need to look at what we always need to look at the business values that organizations are carrying and they need to deliver against, right? So, and that's where, for example, like probably I say technologies that probably they might not make any sense to you, but like the SQL NoSQL conversation, right? Like, shall we go SQL or NoSQL? That's such a wrong question to ask.
Yeah, the sequel's never as good as the original. We know that.
But SQL fulfills certain things that other stuff can't do, right? And so that's why you never have to look in a single dimension to technology, right? And like then why would Google spend so much research money, time, and everything in Spanner, right? A phenomenal, probably one of the largest distributed databases ever created, or Microsoft with Cosmos, right? Or when the masterpiece. I call it the masterpiece just because it's phenomenal. That is DynamoDB and AWS. So there are all those kind of things, right? That organically they require, yes, a less understanding of the first principles and the foundations, right? But I think at the same time, we need to kind of like create more specific use cases so that we can help people making the right choice, right? So it's the both sides. When you create a technology, creating a technology for the sake of creating it doesn't make any sense. But if you can provide the right instruments, the right documentation, the right support for a community to use it in the right way and for a specific set of use cases, that's interesting, right?
And helping people support community. You just gave me the segue I needed to go over to our question and answer period. So I'm sure that a lot of people in the audience are very, very, very eager to start picking this man's mind, as I feel like I've taken up enough of his question period. So we are just going to pause for just 1 second and open up the floor to all of your question and answers. And I can already see that we've got quite a few.
I'm happy that there isn't going to be a pop-up quiz for me following that, but I do feel a little bad for you because it seems I don't understand a couple of these, but it looks like we do have quite a few good questions, and I know you're a busy man, so I'm really just going to jump right into these. So first off, we've got GraphQL is great for complex systems and microservices, but it can also cause a lot of what I feel is unnecessary complexity on other fronts, like query complexity. How do you balance this? Whew.
Like we mentioned earlier, right? So there are kind of like upsides and downsides of using GraphQL, and I think query complexity can be one of those challenges, right? That we need to overcome. But I mean, personally, I never encountered a situation where the query complexity was way too high compared to the benefits of the results that it could bring to me. So it's always like a trade game, right? Of what are you able to trade off in exchange of a cleaner, output to your clients. In terms of like query complexity, yes. So it all boils down to how you design your models, right? So that kind of complexity, it's something that we will never be able to overcome, because that complexity is representative of a system that we're integrating with, or a system that we are designing, right? So yeah, I personally never really encountered that problem, because probably I've been playing with GraphQL since it was even a prototype. So that's the reality.
Fair enough. Okay, up next. Again, these are in no particular order. And I'm just going to go with the audience's better judgment here and assume that these are all pertinent. So how would you handle the challenge of rate limiting with GraphQL? For example, in a REST API, you can simply specify that we allow only this amount of requests in one day. But in GraphQL, it is difficult to specify this type of statement.
True, false. I mean, if you expose directly your API, you're already doing a mistake, right? So, and when we say about cross-cutting concerns and responsibilities of tiered architecture, I mean, the reality is that if you are, when you are exposing your API, you should have an appliance, something, can be an ingress controller, can be a gateway. You know, you and I have been chatting about probably having a deeper deep dive on what I'm saying, but you know, the concern of rate limiting doesn't belong to the GraphQL API itself. It belongs to the network orchestrator. In this case, for example, I would design it, I would put Kong in front of my GraphQL gateway API or my different APIs, and I would just like shield it with Kong, right? Because the problem is, so I know that the follow-up question might be, yes, but when you have the resolvers, I want also to have rate limiting there, right? You enter the space of super complicated algorithms of distributed and aggregated rate limiting, which are solvable, right? So we know how to solve them mathematically and from a technology standpoint. But at the end of the day, my question is, what kind of business benefit does it really add to have such a fine grained rate limiting, right? So what I would do, I would actually put a nice Kong instance in front of my GraphQL, and I would just go into Kong, set up my rate limiting, and make it Kong's problem. Because at the end of the day, if you are working in a federated model, you still connect to a gateway. So you still have a single entry point to the gateway. So the rate limiting should be done there.
I think that was a nice little teaser to, yeah, I think what will be probably a very good follow-up to this, which will be Kong in the API economy. I'm rather looking forward to that one too. And well answered on the question. It sounded very impressive. I assume it was all very well done. Okay, one thing that I'm having a really hard time getting over is schemas. How do you overcome this challenge?
The same way we had to overcome the challenge of open API specs, same way we were designing RPC or protobuffer. It boils down to, for me, to create very simple models that they represent the domains that you want to expose and the functionalities that you want to expose. So schemas are, there are different ways. Like, for example, in my talk that I mentioned earlier on, in the past, we actually use TypeScript, for example, to represent those models and then auto-generate from TypeScript schema definition to GraphQL. There are other initiatives that are extremely interesting on how to take OpenAPI and convert it into GraphQL. To mention, I know that my friend Matteo is working on something pretty cool in that space. Well, worth to mention that the example that I showed in 2019 was using fully Fastify, and that makes life a million times easier. That's, I think, a masterpiece in terms of Node.js and overall, I think, frameworks and kind of it's a fundamental, and I think it sits at the fulcrum of many technology movements and many technology improvements. So if people want to check something, Fastify, outside of this written in Node, I think the model, it's a universal model that I hope many other languages will apply, because I find it phenomenal. But that kind of schema driven, more kind of a deterministic way of designing application will allow also for us to kind of abstract more and more the burden of building schemas, because they will be inherited into other definitions that can be, cross-compiled, converted, transpiled.
So I was hoping one of these would stump you. I'm always, you're just too good at this. But this is a good one. Okay. What are the parameters that you keep in mind while exploring new technologies? As you mentioned that GraphQL was in a prototype, and was in prototype, and why did you choose it at the time? Oh, this is a bit of the history of Luca here.
um, I mean, it's always about creativity, right? And try to think on how we can remove friction and how technology can become a tool that we can leverage, right? So like in that particular case, the magic combination. So I mean, fairly enough, I was very close to the team that was working at Netflix on Falcor, and so I've been exposed to that problem since the early stage of, you know, when I was working on a different distributed system. Um, so it was kind of like organically for me to fall into GraphQL, because I've been, once again, when I told the history, I've been part of experimenting with all those technologies and try to kind of find a better way to kind of create these universal APIs. This way where I'm a strong believer that the API should be somehow something that in a couple of years we're going to forget about, that we will not have to design, that will be somehow you know, coming out of the box. And I know that I'm gonna provoke some people in this space, but I believe that, you know, there is a, like, for example, I didn't mention, but I mean, we probably will talk in our next chat, but I can give a tease. I built in the past a prototype where we actually we put in production using Kong to solve exactly this problem. So it always depends on what kind of like programming interface you want to expose to your developers and what kind of like major problem you want to abstract. For me, the problem was purely, I can tell you where the problem came from. I had this idea that I wanted to have a single API call to get all this dynamic data that was coming in real time. And then I came into materialization and so on. But yeah, so the parameters that I use are mostly kind of like trying to look. I'm saying something that I steal from one of my inspiration, that is Massimo Bottura, famous chef. And if anybody of you watched the Netflix show, you see that when he created Oops, I Dropped the Lemon Tart, he actually told Taka, the sous chef, that he had to look at the problem with a different optic, right? And so that's what I use to look at different technology and different problems. What kind of new optic can we put here, right?
So it's not, it wouldn't be fair to say that you approach everything with the same lens, because half of the the innovation really comes from viewing those technologies in that new lens, or in different lights, correct?
Yeah, there's always the balance that, I see many people that they go for the path of dumbing down technology and using the
I love those people,
right? But at the same time, what does it bring that to me? I don't want to bring implementation complexity, but the simplest thing, and we go back to Einstein, right? The greatest principles are the one that are the simplest to explain, but that they require an entire life to discover, right? And so that's for me the whole thing, right? Is like the complexity of coming to those discoveries. That's the interesting piece. But at the same time, I don't want to expose this complexity to the consumers, because then we are not evolving. We're just circling back.
That's a beautiful way to end it off. And I'm a little actually upset at you on one point that you just said, that your controversial statement that you imagine a future where there is no such thing as APIs. But if we remember at the beginning of this webinar, I just finally figured out what APIs are. So if you want to get rid of them, as soon as I just finally kind of grasp them all,
I just want to, I just believe that 80% probably, I don't know the right percentage, but the majority of them could just be a consequence, right? So I'm a strong believer of the concept of causality as a nuclear physicist, but for me, the term causality is extremely important, because it represents exactly this kind of like new world, right? So why do I need to build something that is inherently already there? It's already there. It's just that I need to surface it. So why do I need to overinvest to surface it when I can just like get it out of some automation, some sort of like implicit conversion, some transpilation, right?
It's not about creating necessarily something new. It's just about a new approach to what's already existing.
Yeah, there are a million ways of making pizza or making other things. That doesn't
Can you-
set one to be the right one or the other one to be the wrong one. But the
You
fact
taught
that
me that
there,
there's only one way to make mozzarella. You said that you've got to strangle it if you remember last time.
yeah, it's true, right? But that doesn't, I think that's why I love food and cooking, is because I think they are the closest representation of technology, and technology somehow should learn from many things that happen in the kitchen, right? So we could have a nice talk on how I interpret like leadership and tech leadership being like in a kitchen, but that's the whole thing, right? So that's why when I mentioned a chef, as a favorite knife, but that doesn't mean that I can't use any other knife to cook, right?
Oh, absolutely. But it looks like we might be getting into something that could easily go on to a whole other event. So I'm going to cut it right there. Luca, as always, thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule. I know I've probably already made you late for another meeting. That's okay. You can tell them to email me. You can blame it on me. It's all right. I know the audience is super grateful that you took the time to share everything and answer all of these questions. There's quite a few more questions that we didn't get a chance to, but it always gives us a great excuse for a follow-up. I hope everybody enjoyed themselves. You probably already got the spoiler that the next one coming up might be Kong in the API economy, but we'll see what happens.
Who knows?
In the meantime, yeah, who knows? We've got a lot of fun stuff in the works, but keep your eye out on all of our socials in your inbox. We'll be circulating a recording of today's webinar, as well as promoting some new fresh stuff we got coming out of the kitchen, as Luca likes to put it. So everybody, enjoy the rest of your day. Keep safe, and we'll talk soon.